So today we are going to be hearing from my colleague Lauren Shimonik, who is a senior policy analyst in the NGA Center for Best Practices. Josh Cunningham is going to be presenting on behalf of the National Conference of State Legislatures, and Dexter Horn is a research analyst who's going to be presenting on behalf of the Council of State Governments. And then after each of them have given a brief presentation, as I mentioned, Bobby Silverstein, who is the Legislative and Policy Counsel for SEED, is going to be moderating a discussion. So we'll just jump right into that once Dexter is done with his presentation. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Lauren to kick us off.
Thank you, Madeline. Just want to say it's an honor to co-present with our SEED partners at NCSL and CSG. It's great to hear from Jennifer on why SEED and the work of ODEP is mission critical to the US DOL. And I'm looking forward to being in conversation with our partners and my colleague Madeline. The panel discussion led by one of the project's key subject matter experts, Bobby Silverstein. So I'm going to briefly discuss the context and opportunity for State Action Lab series and provide some state examples that align with key Action Lab objectives. But first, want to provide a bit of context to help frame the foundation for our new Governor's Guide, promoting employment for people with disabilities through statewide coordination, and the imperative for bringing together 6 state teams that in a relatively short amount of time work to develop action plans. So what we know from previous economic recessions and the indicators of an early onset movement towards the future of work informed how we see challenges and opportunities, recognizing that the coronavirus-induced impact on the labor market did not follow the same script we saw in the Great Recession. We wanted to highlight potential challenges that people with disabilities in the labor market might face. We also wanted to counterbalance some of the challenges with what we see as opportunities for people with disabilities in the context of more recently released labor market information and the changing labor market. In our memo released back in March, Governor's role in promoting disability employment in COVID-19 recovery strategies, a byproduct of NGA's participation in SEED, we addressed the following challenges and opportunities. So challenges: people with disabilities are more likely to have become unemployed due to the pandemic. People with disabilities who lose their jobs during a recession may be less likely to return. More people may become newly eligible or choose to file disability benefits. And people with disabilities face barriers to remaining at work. And again, to counterbalance some of these challenges contextually, opportunities. The labor force participation rate has been relatively steady for people with disabilities, indicating that people who are laid off want to go back to work. And as Jennifer said, there is ample opportunity to help engage those that would like to work and bring them back into the labor force. The changing nature of work poses an opportunity to expand supports for new modes of increasingly flexible work, as I myself am working remotely now and giving this presentation. A heightened awareness of workplace safety may pose opportunity for more inclusive workplaces and openness to implementing accommodations. I also want to point out in our Governor's Guide, we do see a strategic opportunity in leveraging trends in remote work, skills-based training models, on-demand work or gig work, as it's defined, and automation. And we recognize the opportunity for state economic prosperity through greater inclusivity of people with disabilities as part of a governor-led economic recovery strategy. I'll now talk about the Action Lab series that informed the Governor's Guide. So through a competitive process, we selected 6 states who demonstrated a strong commitment and capacity to engage in action planning and undertake meaningful change and support people with disabilities in the recovery efforts. This Action Lab series invited governors to assemble teams of key stakeholders and collaborate around ways to leverage the trends previously noted to promote employment opportunities for people with disabilities throughout economic recovery and beyond. Through this series, state teams engaged in peer learning and action planning to incorporate disability employment as a statewide policy throughout the workforce system. Jennifer mentioned the teams. I'll go ahead and mention them again here, and you can see them on the map. Kansas, Maryland, Montana, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee all participated in this Action Lab series. Each team included at least one representative from the governor's office, one representative from the state's vocational rehabilitation agency, and up to 4 representatives from other entities that play a significant role in the state's disability employment ecosystem. Some states were a little bit smaller based on the scale and size of the state, and some had really robust teams. And it is always worth pointing out that NGA is a huge proponent of state solutions. While there are many similarities across states, the process to arrive at a state solution must consider what is both generalizable and how we can help inform states through best practices and what is unique in each state, the intricacies of state-specific partnerships, programs, and infrastructure. What is seemingly a challenge is also the entry point to how states approach this collaborative work, which really comes out during state team time and helps inform how we at NGA and SEED partners can help states focus on their homegrown state solutions through peer learning and action planning and other technical assistance activities. So, want to talk about the NGA SEED Spring 2021 Action Lab series. The Governor's Guide is based on a 4-part series where states have the opportunity and space to learn from subject matter experts and then engage in action planning through team time. Sometimes the best subject matter experts, though, are states themselves. Well, of course, our SEED partners, and the SEED partnership allows for the capacity to triangulate a network of thinkers and doers. The Action Lab series focused on these 4 key objectives you see on the screen here and had states work through associated action plan activities. I'm not going to read these out, but this structured approach allowed for an organic process for states to set a baseline of understanding with and among themselves and build out from there in their action plans. All right, apologies. So we want to share some of the state examples in the Governor's Guide that also align with the objectives. So we have the 4 objectives. We have 4 state examples. So first up, the great state of Kansas had already established the Employment First Oversight Commission, which acts as a vehicle to understand and map the ecosystem. As a governor-appointed governance structure, it is a convening entity that represents a broad set of stakeholders and has built-in accountability through the submission of an annual report that goes to the governor and to the state legislature. Right. We also want to point out the work in Pennsylvania. You know, we often talk about and get questions about how to keep systems accountable. Some of that is inherent in programs in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, but it's also very strong opportunity for states and governance entities, as well as partnerships to help a shared accountability framework to move the work forward. Developing and measuring key outcomes is a best practice, and to do just exactly that, help keep systems, institutions, and also a collaborative process accountable to objectives and what's mission critical. In Pennsylvania, the state has established employment first target metrics through an independent commission, which is tasked with developing measurable goals, tracking outcomes, and then holding up those recommendations. Montana did have one of the smaller teams, but probably one of the more actionable, as they were able to cover a lot of ground very quickly. And since governors play a central role in enabling cross-system, cross-agency coordination, Montana's Disability Employment and Transition Services Division plays this coordinating role. So it's centralized, and partners respect that coordinating role. Bringing together key partners, that included vocational rehabilitation program, as was outlined in who we asked to be a part of these teams, community rehabilitation providers, WIOA Title I providers, and Montana's K-12 education system often coordinate activities, including procurement processes, and also model their programs with their partners through these partnerships. And then I think the last state that we want to share that really aligns with the objectives that are laid out in the Governor's Guide. A lot of this work takes takes commitment. It's really about being people-driven. So, there's also the ability for there to be dedicated resources in kind or otherwise. There's a lot of coordination, and it's incredibly complex. In all of this, though, the goal is, once established, how do you keep this work sustainable? So we wanted to highlight the ability for a state like Maryland, who has sustained this work since 2004, when the state first created a cabinet-level cross-disability policy agency. They embody many of the other best practices that have been discussed through keeping the system accountable, developing partnerships, having coordinated roles. The state has institutionalized these roles and responsibilities that help then sustain this high level of coordination and collaboration, and is thus further fortified in the development of a state plan. And we are huge proponents of state plans because they are the strategic blueprint for not just that continued coordination, but using some vernacular from the programmatic level, continuous improvement. I know that we're going to have some moderated discussion and opportunities for questions. So with that, Madeline, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to you, and thank you very much for the time to present on this important resource.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And I am actually just going to hand it directly over to Josh for his presentation about the role that NCSL is playing in this space.
Great, thank you so much, Madeline, for that, and Lauren for that information as well. As Madeline mentioned, my name is Josh Cunningham. I'm with the National Conference of State Legislatures. We are a membership organization for all state legislators and legislative staff in all 50 states and U.S. territories. And I'm going to kind of talk to you today about the role that the legislature plays in this policy area and ways that you can partner with your legislature as you work on these issues. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So quick little civics recap. Some of the key responsibilities that are relevant to this conversation of responsibilities of the state legislature include, of course, writing laws, changing them, deleting them, adding new ones, setting budgets, setting budget priorities, as well as appropriating funding to state agencies and programs and services, conducting oversight, which allows the legislature to study and inquire about specific programs, how they're working, how they can be improved. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how they can convene people. So the use of study committees, interim committees, and task forces, and really bringing stakeholders together into one room to really dive deep into specific policy issues and identify key areas that the laws, existing laws in a state, can be improved to help achieve a certain policy goal. So move to the next slide. So what does that mean for this conversation today, and how can your legislature help you as you work on kind of disability inclusive employment policies? Of course, updating state laws to reflect kind of the changing nature of work. The pandemic has rapidly increased and accelerated the shift to a more digital-based economy. So states are in a position now to look at their existing laws and employment laws and evaluate whether those are keeping up with that shift and what changes might need to occur. One area, and this is something that NCSL actually tracks very closely, we have a legislative database that we track the disability employment legislation in. But some highlights include expanding access to broadband that we saw a number of states look at as a result of the pandemic. Some Mississippi, Missouri, and Virginia are some examples of states that enacted legislation seeking to kind of improve access to broadband technology, really for the purpose of making telework more accessible to all citizens of their states. Looking at wage and benefits laws to see if they are keeping pace with the changing nature and shift more towards contract-based work and gig workers. And then, as Lauren mentioned, employment first initiatives, which really help unify state services and programs around the idea that employment is accessible and should be available to all people in your state, regardless of disability status, and that the services provided to people with disabilities has this employment preference in mind throughout those services. So those are things that can be done, yes, at the governor level, but also can be initiated through your legislature, and sometimes requires legislation to initiate those. Some other things that legislatures can do, they can convene short-term task forces and interim committees and study committees to look at very specific issues. For example, New Jersey recently enacted a couple bills that are establishing task forces. So I think they have a task force that's going to look at accessible transportation, and also another task force that's looking at employment gaps for people with disabilities. And these committees can really help bring a wide range of stakeholders into the room together to dig into these issues and make sure that all the relevant perspectives are represented. And Indiana is another example. I think they created a study committee looking at barriers that people with disabilities face to achieving competitive integrated employment. Those are short-term committees, kind of temporary. Legislatures can also help establish more long-term working groups. These are designed to transcend over time and to sustain over time, including from one administration to the next, really establishing long-term working groups and a culture of interagency collaboration. Some examples would be, Lauren mentioned, a lot of states have these employment first commissions or councils that help run and oversee their employment first initiatives and making sure that the relevant state agencies are represented. An example of that that I found was done legislatively actually a couple of years ago was Delaware. Well, they amended a couple of years ago. It's been around for a while, but Delaware has a employment first oversight committee, and it includes representatives from Health and Human Services and labor, and from vocational rehabilitation, and from the DD Council, and a number of relevant education department, like all these stakeholders in the room together that convene regularly and really help coordinate the services and supports that are provided to workers and to people with disabilities. And lastly, they can fund programs that prioritize interagency collaboration. An example I like to use is from Washington State, where they have their centers of occupational health and education, which help folks who are injured at work re-engage and return to the workforce in a safe and quick time. And that really requires a coordination of a number of different state agencies. And this is something that is designed in law, that is funded, and that really prioritizes, again, that collaboration to ensure that the services being provided are as high quality as possible. Next slide, please. So quickly, just a few extra tips that I want to throw out there for really developing effective partnerships with your legislature. Identifying key legislative champions, and NCSL can actually help with that if needed. We have an ongoing list of like I said, we track legislation, and we identify legislators who are really key champions for disability employment policies, and who really have a history of carrying bills and really learn and take the time to learn and educate themselves on this issue and with the landscape within their state. Work with your relevant committee chairs, of course, engage with the appropriate legislative staff. As you may know, legislative staff are really the keepers of the institutional knowledge in legislatures, and have the capacity to do a lot of the groundwork that is required to push these policies forward. And NCSL can also plug us, can help and bring legislators to the table, to the conversation as these issues are being discussed in your states. Next slide. And I just wanted to briefly mention the fact that we talked about funding and budgeting, and there's funds available to states right now. So American Rescue Plan Act, federal law that I'm sure you all are aware of, that's pushed a lot of money to the states to be used to help in economic recovery. This can include employment programs. And so looking at how your state is using or planning to use the ARPA funds in a way that is either disability inclusive on a kind of broader scale, or if you have specific programs even that you are interested in funding that would help more targeted towards workers with disabilities. The options are pretty broad for using these funds. And I would encourage you to talk to your legislative leaders about what their kind of thoughts and plans are. And NCSL actually has a number of really great resources tracking the ARPA funds and how states are using them, allocating them both on a dollar level as well as based on kind of issue area. And I'll post those links. They're in the slides, but I'll post those in the chat as soon as I'm done. But if you can move to the next slide, please. And I think I'm just going to wrap up real quick and plug NCSL's seed resources as well. And I think we'll get into this a little bit more in the discussion at the end of this, but please feel free to reach out to me. Check out our web resources as well related to seed. We have a number of resources available to you. So thank you, and I'll hand it back to you, Madeline.
Great. Thank you very much. And I am just going to hand it right over to Dexter.
Awesome. Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, Lauren and Josh, for your presentations as well. So as Madeline just said, my name is Dexter Horn, and I'm speaking for the Council of State Governments and talking about how we leverage Work Matters to promote statewide coordination with our partners across the country. So next slide, please. All right, so a little bit about the Council of State Governments. So first of all, we were founded in 1933. And we're the nation's largest nonpartisan organization serving all three branches of state elected and appointed officials. The Council of State Governments, or CSG for short, is a region-based forum that fosters collaboration and community between elected and appointed officials from across the country and 6 U.S. territories. CSG's unique national presence, regional approach, and ability to engage with all three branches of state government gives our team the ability to facilitate systems collaboration between policymakers at the executive and legislative level, as well as individuals from workforce, education, personnel, and other state agencies. Next slide, please. And CSG facilitates collaboration in specifically in the disability employment policy space through 4 primary vehicles. So first, national working group; second, state task force engagement; third, through state technical assistance; and then lastly, through our state policy exchanges. And we'll touch on all of those just a little bit in this brief presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so especially through those working groups that I just mentioned, CSG promotes coordination by bringing together policymakers, thought leaders, and subject matter experts on topics surrounding disability employment policy. For example, in partnership with SEED, CSG has developed 2 task forces on disability employment policy issues, which featured governors and executive staff, senators, delegates, representatives, workforce, education, and transportation experts, and more. This large-scale systems collaboration generated frameworks for addressing barriers to employment for individuals with disabilities from multiple perspectives and highlighted gaps and opportunities for employment for individuals with disabilities. So in partnership with SEED and NCSL, we also developed the Work Matters framework, which you can see on the screen there, just a picture of it. And that's a culmination of intensive deliberation and research conducted by the National Task Force on Workforce Development for People with Disabilities. That framework features 13 broad policy options, as well as real-life examples of innovative programs and policies that states have successfully implemented to build strong and inclusive workforces. Next slide. All right. There we go. CSG works with state task force to share Work Matters policy options, provide research, and assist in the logistics of internal state agency coordination. For example, CSG has worked along with SEED to support Alaska in their efforts, including development of research, presentations, and other support services for the Alaska Work Matters Task Force. In March of 2021, Alaska launched the Alaska Work Matters Task Force under the umbrella of the Governor's Council on Disabilities and Special Education and the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. The effort was supported by Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy, the Department of Labor and Workforce Development, the Department of Health and Social Services, the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, as well as a number of other state agencies, including Tribal VR, educational agencies, and more. And the purpose of this task force was threefold, and it's still threefold. First, it was to undertake a review and analysis of existing policies, practices, procedures, existing barriers, and existing workforce utilization data regarding the employment of people with disabilities in that state. Second, it was to prepare a report within 12 months from the effective date of February 2021 that includes recommendations for policies, practices, and procedures to improve employment opportunities and outcomes for individuals with disabilities. And finally, to maximize current funding within the state of Alaska to increase the employment outcomes for Alaskans with disabilities. And that's not just with Alaska. CSG is engaged in similar efforts in New Jersey and in my home state of Kentucky as well. Next slide, please. And then in partnership with SEED, CSG provides technical assistance to enable policy leaders to develop and implement forward-thinking solutions adapted to state and regional conditions to improve the lives of people and the strength of the communities of those states. In this effort, CSG conducts outreach and accepts research requests. Disability employment areas of technical assistance have included information on fast-track hiring authorities in Virginia, the future of the workforce for the Texas Governor's Committee on Disabilities, transportation issues for Massachusetts, and the list goes on. And a quick example of this technical assistance would be that request we fulfilled for the Commissioner of the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind, or MCB, who provided a 50-state policy scan on ID cards offered to persons who are visually impaired or have some other type of disability. And this research was done to inform how MCB could expand the benefits and keep low the cost of their ID cards through memorandums of understanding with other state government agencies within Massachusetts. So again, statewide coordination featured prominently in our work there. Next slide. And then recently, the Council of State Governments convened a group of policymakers from across 6 states to discuss best practices in inclusive employment policy. Policymakers from Alabama, Illinois, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Washington, and West Virginia shared examples of successful disability employment initiatives in their states and insights into the process for implementing them. In addition to learning best practices, participants learned about how their peers could overcome similar challenges that they face in their states. And they also learned on how to capitalize on new opportunities. And final slide for me. To learn more about the work that we're doing in the states around disability employment issues and then other inclusive workforce initiatives, feel free to contact me. Again, my name is Dexter Horn, or my boss, Dina Klimkina, who is much smarter and also on the call right now. Her contact information is on the screen as well. And then finally, just want to say thank you for your time and looking forward to some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Dexter. And I am going to hand it over to Bobby. I do know we are a little short on time, but if you all in the audience do have questions as we start this discussion, feel free to enter them in the chat. I can't guarantee we will get to them in the next 20 minutes or so, but we will follow up afterwards with any questions that you have. We can respond via email. So we encourage you to keep those coming, even if we may not be able to respond to them right now. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bobby and ask all the other presenters to come back on camera.
Great. Thank you. Again, my name is Bobby Silverstein. I'm the Legislative and Policy Counsel for the SEED project. I am the former, my phone is about to ring, sorry. I will shut that off, sorry. That's part of what happens when we're at home. I'm the former staff director and chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy, worked on the Americans with Disabilities Act, special ed, vocational rehabilitation, technology, a bunch of other topic areas. Think about it for 30 seconds. NGA, CSG, and NCSL all on the same call. What a message for all that disability policy is of concern to all these groups and they're willing to work together and collaborate. I just think that is a message in and of itself. A lot of policymakers at the executive legislative level say, I'd like to do something on disability policy, but I don't know who to go to, where to get the assistance. I know the advocates are out there, but sometimes I need or want information from my colleagues. Well, SEED is there to fill that void. And you see by this webinar, the power that exists, the opportunity, the resources that you have at your hand. These folks can answer any question that you have, whether it's state as a model employer or engaging the private sector or transportation or transition for youth, technology, disability-owned businesses, stay at work, return to work, whatever the issue, employment first, coordination, collaboration amongst agencies, whatever the issue, these folks are here and have the resources. So let's jump in for an example. COVID is on everybody's mind. We're trying to recover. We're trying to figure out how to go back to the workforce. Could you all share a little bit more about the resources, and hopefully we can put things in the chat room that you've done for long COVID, telework, health and safety, workforce readiness, mental health issues? You all have spent a lot of time working on these issues and to ensure that in all cases that they're disability inclusive. Could you take a little time to share some more about the resources that you all have put together?
Yeah, I can go first just on the telework one. It'll also give me an opportunity to shout out Bobby because he worked on this publication, and we can drop this in the chat in just a second. But Disability Inclusive Telework for States is a report that Bobby worked on alongside with one of my colleagues, Elise Gurney. And that provides a guide for developing and or modifying telework policies and programs to be inclusive of people with disabilities. So that's a good one, a good place to start when you're just looking at sort of alternative workspaces and continuing the telework policies that we've seen really take off during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I certainly want to highlight NCSL we did recently publish a series of reports looking at the impact that COVID-19 has had on employment for people with disabilities. We covered issues like the rise of telework as and the opportunities that presents for workers with disabilities. We looked at returning to the workplace safely and providing appropriate workplace accommodations. We looked at work readiness programs and long-term recovery efforts to ensure that we're closing those skill gaps and educating and training workers with disabilities to be able to find employment in this kind of new economy that we're all seeing right now. And I would also love to plug our health team, which tracks a lot of our kind of public health information, including mental health, including vaccinations and long COVID, and a lot of these really pressing issues.
And Madeline or Lauren?
Yeah, I was just going to share, we, right at the beginning of COVID, published a sort of compilation of just a lot of really innovative strategies the vocational rehabilitation programs were using to respond to COVID, especially when things were moving virtual. And though it was kind of in response to those very early stages of the pandemic, there were some really innovative practices that were kind of revealed through that process and just showed how, new agencies coming together and forming partnerships to really support disability employment. And then since then, we have really started thinking, our more recent resources have been much more focused around kind of thinking about disability employment as a really foundational component of workforce recovery and making sure that the needs of people with disabilities are centered in all workforce development strategies for states. So, and we'll be sure to share all of these resources in an email after this webinar as well. Yeah.
Great. And Dexter, you also have a blog, which includes a reference to every single federal policy guidance related to COVID, all from a disability perspective, from the equal employment opportunity to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, to OSHA at the Department of Labor, all put together with links to all of the federal policy guidance on COVID. It's an incredible resource, and it's on your blog, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct. It also includes a lot of the resources of the SEED affiliates. So, NCSL, NGA, CSG, and others too. So you can find those federal resources along with these intermediary organizations, what we put together all in that one place. And if Dina, oh, she's already beat me to it, so never mind.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning it,
Right.
Bobby.
And there's one other thing that Jennifer mentioned, which is the COVID-19 frameworks on health and safety plans. A lot of folks are developing now. There's a resource that pulls together what your colleagues around the country are doing. The essence of SEED, as you can tell, is steal, borrow. But it's not from the feds, it's borrow from your colleagues around at the state and local level. And it's this collaboration between these organizations that is really making this happen and come alive. And Lauren, you kind of focused on, we need this, these are complex issues at the state level, oftentimes. And oftentimes they're silos, and one agency is doing something and the other agency doesn't. Tell us a little bit more of some of the kind of outcomes of your action lab where folks are talking to each other. And Dexter, you had some a similar initiative. How are you getting folks to truly collaborate and break down those silos?
I mean, it's a great question, because I think, you know, different policy areas, the process can look the same, but I think when you have, you know, maybe this gets to how you identify champions or advocates within those spaces. I mean, we did outreach through governor's offices. So where that is a priority, and where there's some capacity and resources to help bring those folks together was, you know, the galvanizing factor. You know, when states come together, just to really simplify it, there's some states that have been doing some work in this area, maybe have some relationships, partnerships, and identified policy and programmatic connections that they can build off of. So there's a little bit of a foundation. Oftentimes, though, there are some states that are looking at more robust ways to make those partnerships, those connections. Having somebody that can be either that champion or advocate, also having a coordinating entity. I talked about this, and I think we've heard this from both Josh and Dexter as well. When you have a commission, when you have a task force, whether it's instituted through legislation or through a governor's executive order, that really becomes a powerful statement. Through that process, then you see those, you know, state representatives that can really help carry that process forward. And I think everyone responds really well when you have someone in a leadership position, be it a governor, someone in the governor's office, or someone at the agency level, help move that process forward. But it's complex work, and it takes time. And being able to build in these spaces, such as we were able to do in the Action Lab series, is a great first start or another mile marker in the work that states are doing.
Great. Dexter, I know part of what you did working with your states is you did a gap analysis. Could you share with folks that process of doing that gap analysis and the documents that you at CSG provided to the states to help them think through policy options, learning from other states as well?
Yeah, and I want to first say that I agree with Lauren. I don't know if there's like one way to answer the issue of getting people out of their silos. One of the things that we try to do at CSG and through the SEED initiative is just creating opportunities for people who are in different silos to talk about the same thing. So with our convenings, and most recently with the state exchange, sort of the methodology that we used was to first present research to individuals who are interested in expanding the workforce of their state and who are interested in that expansion being inclusive, and saying, here are the ways that we've seen to do that effectively. And that's the Work Matters framework. And within the Work Matters framework, that gave us the opportunity to say, well, here's what you're already doing from our research. So it's a preliminary scan. There's always a possibility that we missed something. But for the 6 states that participated in our webinar series, we looked at the policies we could find that match up with the Work Matters framework. And then we suggested where the gaps were and where those next steps for these individuals are in order to make those workforces more expansive, more inclusive. And then allowed them to get together and break out rooms because, of course, this was a virtual series, and ask questions about how other states are overcoming the challenges that they face in filling these gaps within this policy tool that we created. And importantly for us, I mean, that conversation helps them. A lot of times it's people from the same state, but working at different agencies, talking to each other, which is effective in what we want to see. But it also helps us as a seed team to know what greater research needs there are across the country, what work we can do to better support you all. So highly encourage going to those convenings by any of the affiliate members of the SEED initiative. And also, even if you weren't one of those 10 states, if you call CSG, NGA, NCSL, or SEED directly and say, hey, we would like a gap analysis of the SEED project, somebody is going to do it for you. So the resources are there if you have questions. Josh, did you want to add anything?
Maybe quickly add, you know, I think that Dexter and Lauren covered a lot of it, but, you know, I talked about really, you know, partnering and leveraging your legislature, and as someone who worked in the legislature previously and have worked with state legislators across this country, I know you're going to have a lot more, make a lot more progress with them if you include them in that conversation as early on as possible, rather than looking at them as kind of an afterthought, like we have this plan, now let's take it to the legislature. Include them in that conversation and get their buy-in to the whole process as well. And we found that that is a really effective way to move these policies forward.
Great. That's your takeaway, Josh. We have about a minute or so left. Any other things, Dexter, Madeline, Lauren, you were on the leave as final takeaways, lessons learned for the audience?
Sure. I think I would just say, like I mentioned, we really have just seen such incredible opportunity for states to not just implement kind of discrete disability employment policies, but really make sure that all of their policies are inclusive and are addressing the needs of workers with disabilities. And I think that having these sort of governance structures in place within the state that are beating the drum and engaging all the relevant stakeholders are so important for being able to advance that work. And we have, you know, lots of examples of how states have been able to accomplish that, and definitely want to support that type of collaboration in any way we can.
Great. And Lauren or Dexter, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just say, you know, we are hearing from states, and we're also hearing from the business community that this is a perfect time to have broad stakeholder engagement. I think, to Madeline's point, and to have a conversation about what this really looks like as far as an opportunity to be inclusive of people with disabilities, and listen to employers and listen to business needs as well, because I think you have willing partners that are ready to be at the table to help find solutions. So that's my big takeaway. Is I think the timing it's a good time to have this discussion.
Jay just asked a question: are some of these gap analyses of states available? I would suggest, Jade, contact Dexter, and we can, if your state was not one of the ones that a gap analysis was done for, we can help you, and one of the partners here will be glad to do that. Looks like we have one more minute. I want to go back to you, Madeline, for time to wrap up.
Great. Thank you, Bobby. And thanks to all of our presenters and to Jennifer for taking the time and participating in today's session. Thank you so much to all of you for participating and taking the time to join us today. We look forward to continuing to work together through the SEED network to support states in promoting disability employment as a statewide priority and advancing disability employment policy. We will continue to keep you all in the loop with opportunities to engage on these topics and encourage you to reach out with any questions, requests for technical assistance, or to share work that is going on in your state you think we should be aware of. We will follow up next week with an email with all of our contact information, with all the links to the resources that we mentioned today. And again, we really encourage you to reach out with any follow-up questions you may have. We're happy to do that type of follow-up. So with that, thank you so much for joining and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Madeline.